He accepted the challenge to pursue a girl, but he had no idea she carried a haunting past tied to him. As things spiraled out of control, the hunter found himself becoming the prey of the very woman he thought he could conquer. The lavish party of New York's elite unfolded under the glow of dazzling chandeliers, the crisp clinking of crystal glasses mingling with bursts of hearty laughter. Familiar faces from the world of tycoons gathered in clusters discussing million-dollar deals and the intricate web of power relationships. At the center of it all stood Ethan Caldwell, chairman of Caldwell Enterprises. Exuding confidence like a king without a throne, he was a victor in every game he played. The business world, women, money, everything bent to his will. Beside him, Ryan Carter, his best friend and the only one bold enough to challenge him, sipped his wine, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Ethan, don't you ever get tired?" Ethan raised an eyebrow, replying nonchalantly, "Tired of what?" Ryan set his glass down, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Tired of always winning. Tired of everything being too easy for you." Ethan laughed. He knew Ryan was trying to provoke him, but he couldn't deny the truth in those words. "Then," Ryan leaned in, his eyes sparkling with a dangerous thrill, "let me give you a challenge. A bet." Ethan crossed his arms, intrigued. "I'm listening." Ryan lowered his voice, as if unveiling a priceless secret. "You're used to beautiful, fragile women who fall easily for your money and charm. I bet you don't have what it takes to marry someone outside your ideal type, someone who won't bow to your power and fame." Ethan chuckled, but a flicker of excitement flashed in his eyes. "And if I take the bet?" Ryan raised his glass, his smile laced with intent. $1 million was pocket change to Ethan. But this challenge? It struck at his pride. He wasn't accustomed to having his abilities questioned. For Ethan Caldwell, there was nothing he couldn't control. "Deal." He clinked his glass against Ryan's, his gaze sharp like a predator's. "Who's the lucky one?" Ryan glanced toward a corner of the room where a woman stood alone, utterly indifferent to the extravagance around her. "Olivia Bennett." Ethan narrowed his eyes. She wasn't like the women who typically flocked to him. Not the type swayed by luxury cars, designer brands, or power. An interesting challenge indeed. 3 days later, Ethan received a dossier on Olivia. She was a lawyer, smart, independent, and unafraid to stand her ground. A self-made woman who relied on no one. She didn't belong to his world, but to Ethan that wasn't an issue. He didn't need love, he just needed to win. Their first meeting took place at an upscale restaurant. When Olivia walked in, her gaze didn't waver at the opulence of the place. She wasn't swayed by the crystal chandeliers or the curious stares of other women eyeing Ethan. She looked straight at him, her cool, confident eyes unflinching. "Ethan Caldwell," she said, her voice calm but devoid of awe. Ethan smiled and extended his hand. "Olivia Bennett." She glanced at his hand for a second before shaking it. A firm, strong grip, no hesitation. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Interesting." Skipping polite small talk, Olivia leaned back, crossed her arms, and said bluntly, "I know about the bet." Ethan faltered for a moment, surprised, but quickly regained his composure. "And you still agreed to meet me?" Olivia studied him, her deep eyes probing. "I have my reasons." Her response piqued Ethan's curiosity. This wasn't a simple pawn, this was a player. "Aren't you afraid of me?" he asked, a smug smile playing on his lips. Olivia gave a faint laugh and shook her head. "You're not scary, Ethan. You're just someone too used to getting everything he wants." Her words sliced into his ego like a knife, but instead of anger, he felt something else. Intrigue. This bet? It might be tougher than he'd thought, but that's what made it worth playing. In the days that followed, Ethan set his plan in motion. He would seduce Olivia. He took her to the most extravagant places, invited her to parties with the most powerful people. He tried to weave himself into her life, step by step. But Olivia wasn't easily swayed. She rejected every gift, refusing to be dazzled by power. When he tried to take control, she pushed back. When he thought he was leading the game, she made him realize he'd never truly been in charge. Ethan was no longer certain who held the upper hand in this game, and that's when it hit him. This wasn't about the bet anymore. This was about Olivia, and she was changing him in ways he couldn't control. Ethan Caldwell was unaccustomed to resistance. In his world, everything revolved around power. He made an offer and people scrambled to accept it. No one ever said no to Ethan Caldwell, until he met Olivia Bennett. Their marriage, though born from a bet, was still supposed to follow rules set by him. Ethan had no doubt that within a few weeks, Olivia would settle into the role of the women before her, pampered, living in luxury, and gradually becoming dependent on him. But Olivia was unlike anyone else. On the very first morning after their wedding, Ethan prepared a gift to demonstrate his generosity. A collection of designer dresses neatly arranged in Olivia's wardrobe, accompanied by an unlimited black credit card. Olivia glanced at the expensive dresses for a mere few seconds before turning to him, her expression neutral. "Thank you, but I don't need them." Ethan raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms and tilting his head. "You don't need them?" Olivia stepped forward, pulling out the most extravagant dress from the rack and holding it up. "Do you think I'd be swayed by a few pieces of clothing?" She gave a faint smile, but there was no softness in her voice. Ethan smirked. "I just want you to have the best." Olivia placed the dress back and met his gaze directly. "The problem is, Ethan, your best isn't my best." A strange sensation flickered through Ethan. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. Women usually loved these things, gifts, lavish offers, but Olivia was different. That only made the game more intriguing. But Ethan wasn't one to give up easily. The next day, he shifted tactics. If she didn't care for dresses, he'd draw her into his world another way. Ethan arranged a party at one of New York's most luxurious hotels. It was a gathering place for the elite, where the rich and powerful brokered deals behind polite smiles. He wanted Olivia to see the stark contrast between his world and hers. When she stepped out of the car, the dazzling lights illuminated her beautiful but unimpressed face. Olivia didn't wear a glamorous gown like the other women in the room. She chose a simple, elegant dress, free of any overt signs of wealth. She wasn't there to blend in. She was there to confront. Ethan escorted her around, introducing her, waiting for the moment she'd falter or feel out of place amid conversations about investments, politics, and billion-dollar deals. But instead, Olivia responded to everything with sharp wit and unwavering confidence. When a powerful businesswoman asked what she thought of tycoons like Ethan, Olivia took a sip of wine and gave a faint smile. Powerful men think they control the world, but in reality they're just puppets of their own greed. Ethan watched her, a strange fascination creeping into his mind. She was unlike anyone he'd ever met, and that only fueled his desire to conquer her more. The next battle took place in their home. Ethan had rearranged Olivia's schedule without telling her. He wanted her to spend more time at home, away from work. She was his wife now. She didn't need to work anymore. But when Olivia found out, she didn't react as he'd anticipated. No anger, no shouting, no arguing. She simply stood there, arms crossed, staring at him with piercing eyes. "Ethan, I'm not a puppet in your hands." Ethan smiled, slowly stepping closer to her. "I just thought you'd be happier without the stress of work." Olivia nodded, as if considering his words. "Interesting?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What's interesting?" She smiled faintly. "Interesting how a man so used to controlling others can't handle not controlling me?" Ethan froze. It was the first time someone had seen through him so clearly. In that moment, Ethan realized something. Olivia wasn't a pawn on his chessboard. She was a player. And this game, it was only just beginning. Ethan Caldwell had never lost control, but Olivia Bennett was changing everything. At first, she was just a pawn in his game, a bet he was certain he'd win, but as the days passed, Ethan realized he was no longer the one steering this game. He wanted Olivia to depend on him. He wanted her to need him. But instead, he was the one who couldn't stop thinking about her. Ethan first noticed it one evening when he returned to the penthouse after a long day. In his mind, everything followed a familiar script. Olivia would be in the living room, perhaps waiting for him, or at least wondering why he was late. But when Ethan opened the door, the apartment was eerily silent. No Olivia in the living room, no eyes turning toward him, no questions, no trace of concern. He passed by the kitchen. She'd eaten dinner without waiting for him. A strange feeling crept into Ethan's chest. Not annoyance, not anger, but a peculiar obsession. Could she really live without him? Ethan couldn't accept that. The next morning, he scheduled an appointment with a renowned interior designer, instructing them to transform an empty room in the penthouse into a private office for Olivia. He thought that if she had a space here, she'd feel at home. She'd stay. She'd belong to his world. But when Olivia stepped into the newly decorated room, her eyes didn't light up with joy. Instead, they held skepticism. She turned to him slowly. "Ethan, I don't recall asking for this." He gave a light smile, hands in his pockets, brimming with confidence. "I just wanted you to feel more comfortable. Now you can work here. No need to go out." Olivia stared at him for a long moment, then shook her head. "Do you think giving me an office here will make me abandon the world out there?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Why struggle out there when you have everything you need right here?" Olivia stepped toward him, her sharp eyes seeming to pierce through his thoughts. "It's not about me needing a place to work, Ethan. You just want another way to control me." For the first time, Ethan had no comeback. He needed a new plan. This time, Ethan employed a bolder tactic. He interfered with Olivia's career in a way she couldn't easily resist, causing trouble for the law firm where she worked by disrupting their partnerships. He manipulated financial connections, making it difficult for her firm to secure contracts and stalling critical projects. Ethan didn't act directly. He simply pulled a few strings of power. And then, when Olivia confronted him that evening, her eyes were filled with suspicion. "Ethan?" Her voice was icy. He smiled as if nothing was amiss. "What's wrong?" Olivia crossed her arms, staring straight at him. "Don't think I don't know what you're doing." Ethan leaned back, his smile unwavering. "I'm just trying to take some pressure off you, Olivia." She gave a faint laugh. "Cutting ties between me and my firm's partners? Freezing my company's key projects? That's your idea of helping?" Ethan stood and stepped closer to her. He fixed her with the look that had made countless women before her submit, a possessive, challenging gaze. "I don't want you to have to work so hard. If you need anything, you can just tell me." His voice was low, smooth, but laced with authority. Olivia raised an eyebrow, her gaze unflinching. "What do you think I need, Ethan?" He didn't answer, but Olivia already knew. Ethan wanted her to need him, but in reality, he was the one who needed her. And then, that night, everything shifted. Ethan couldn't sleep. For the first time in his life, he felt out of control. He tried to make Olivia a part of his world, but she didn't budge. He tried to control her life, but she stood firm. He'd done everything to keep her close, yet he was the one losing his bearings. And the worst part? He didn't know if he was doing all this for the bet anymore, or because Olivia had become something vital to him. Ethan shot up from bed, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and stared out at the city's dark skyline. He'd never felt like this before. Never. He'd always been the manipulator, the controller. But now, with just a glance, a dismissive look, a moment of indifference from Olivia, she was controlling him, and it was driving him mad. This game, it wasn't a game anymore. Olivia Bennett had become Ethan Caldwell's obsession. The atmosphere in Ethan Caldwell's penthouse had never been so heavy. Olivia Bennett sat quietly in the living room, her hands clasped together, but her eyes were as sharp and cold as a blade. She had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Ethan walked in, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, still wearing his usual smug demeanor. But something in Olivia's gaze made him pause. Something was wrong. With a slow, deliberate motion, Olivia placed a stack of documents on the glass table between them. Her voice was calm, terrifyingly so. "Do you remember Richards Industries, Ethan?" Ethan frowned. The name rang like a faint echo from the past, one of the countless companies he'd faced off against, crushed on his path to building his empire. He shook his head. "No." Olivia let out a soft laugh, but there was no trace of amusement in it, only mockery and bitterness. "Of course you don't." She looked up, her eyes glinting with carefully restrained hatred. "People like you never remember the ones you've trampled." Ethan blinked. An unfamiliar feeling crept into his mind. Olivia pulled the documents toward her, her fingers brushing lightly over the worn cover, as if touching a scar that had long since crusted over. "Will help you remember." She looked at him, a flicker of pain passing through her eyes. "That company belonged to my father." The room fell silent. Ethan suddenly felt the air around him thicken. Olivia leaned forward, each word she spoke piercing his mind like a needle. "Do you know what happened when you targeted that company?" Ethan didn't respond, but Olivia didn't need him to. "My father spent his whole life building it. He wasn't a brilliant businessman, not a cunning fox in the corporate world like you. He was just a hard-working man who believed in the value of honesty. He didn't know how to play dirty. But you did." She gave a faint smile, unable to hide the bitterness. "You took him down with your underhanded tactics. You turned his partners against him, manipulated the market, cut off every chance the company had to survive." Ethan couldn't recall the specifics. How many companies had he done this to? To him, they were just numbers, successful deals, weak players eliminated from the board. But to Olivia, it was an entire life destroyed. "And do you know what happened after that, Ethan?" Her voice dropped, like an undercurrent about to swallow everything whole. Ethan stayed silent, but his body tensed. He didn't want to hear more, but it was too late. "My father killed himself." Her words hit the room like a punch to Ethan's chest. He felt as though a cold hand had gripped his heart. He couldn't bear losing everything he'd built. He couldn't handle the humiliation of watching my mother cry every night, of seeing me pretend everything was fine. And then, one day, he was gone. The police found him in his car, on a bridge with a suicide note on the back seat. Olivia's voice trembled for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. Ethan said nothing. He couldn't. She looked straight at him, her eyes sharp as knives, brimming with accusation. "And do you know the worst part, Ethan?" She gave a pained smile. "I was pregnant at the time." Ethan felt his entire body go numb. Pregnant, his heart pounded as he stared at Olivia, but she didn't give him a chance to speak. "The loss, the shock, the pain, it all weighed on me, and then I lost the baby." Ethan stumbled back a step, as if someone had struck him in the stomach. He couldn't breathe. Olivia held that gaze, the look of a woman who had lost everything. "You took my father from me," she said, her voice cutting like a blade. "You took my child from me." She stood, her steps slow but carrying a terrifying weight. "And why do you think I agreed to this bet, Ethan?" He stared at her, his eyes hollow. "Did you think I married you because of your game?" "No," Olivia whispered. She leaned down, her face close to his, her voice as cold as a winter wind. "I married you so you'd know what it feels like to lose control." Ethan suddenly realized he had never been the one in charge of this game. Olivia Bennett had been orchestrating it all from the start, and now the board had been completely flipped. Ethan Caldwell sat silently on the sofa, the vast penthouse around him, suddenly feeling strangely suffocating. The city lights of New York streamed through the glass windows, reflecting off the crystal table, but everything blurred before the storm raging in his mind. Olivia Bennet had broken him. Her every word still echoed in his head like an unappealable verdict. "You took my father from me. You took my child from me." Ethan clenched his fists, his breathing heavy. He'd heard countless grievances before, seen too many losers crumble under his decisions, but no one had ever made him feel like this. For the first time, he didn't know what to do. Olivia's silence was more terrifying than her words. The next morning, Ethan tried to talk to her, but she only glanced at him, offering no response. When he called her name, Olivia walked past him as if he didn't exist. Ethan was used to hatred. He knew how to handle open enemies. But this wasn't hatred, it was emptiness, and that destroyed him more than anything else. Ethan's collapse began with the small things. Olivia didn't yell. She didn't cry. She didn't demand anything from him. She simply stopped caring about him. At first, Ethan thought it would pass, that with time her coldness would fade. But with each passing day, the distance between them grew wider. Breakfast, Olivia ate alone, not waiting for him, not even glancing his way. Evenings, she didn't come home on time, and when she did, she offered no explanation. Conversations, reduced to short, curt replies. Ethan, the man who always held everything in his grasp, felt abandoned for the first time. Desperation crept into Ethan's mind in ways he'd never experienced. He tried to regain control. He tried to break through the wall she'd built. One late night, Olivia sat in the living room, curled up in a sweater, reading under the soft glow of a lamp. She looked serene, as if she no longer cared about what had happened. Ethan couldn't stand it. He approached her, his voice low but firm. "We need to talk." Olivia didn't look up. She turned the page of her book as if she hadn't heard him. Ethan clenched his fists, his tone growing more urgent. "Olivia." Still no reaction. Her indifference cut into his pride like a knife. Ethan stepped closer until only a few paces separated them. He leaned down, lowering his voice. "I know you're trying to punish me, but..." Finally, Olivia looked up. There was no hatred in her eyes, no anger, just emptiness. "I'm not punishing you, Ethan," she said, her voice feather-light. "I just don't care anymore." Her words struck him like a heavy blow to the chest. He could handle harsh words, outbursts of anger. But indifference? It was tearing him apart, piece by piece. Ethan couldn't sleep. Every night he tossed and turned, tormented by Olivia's words. He dug up old files, searching for information about her father's company, trying to recall what he'd done. And then he found it all. Everything she'd said was true. Ethan had crushed Richards Industries with ruthless moves, leaving it no chance of survival, and he'd never cared. He'd never once wondered what lay behind a deal. Now he knew. But the worst was yet to come. Olivia wasn't just ignoring him. She was dismantling him, step by step. Critical contracts were delayed for no apparent reason. Trusted partners abruptly shifted course, refusing to work with him. He knew who was behind it. Olivia didn't need to touch his finances. She didn't need to take anything from him. She only needed to make others see Ethan Caldwell the way she saw him, and then they turned their backs on him of their own accord. One night when Ethan returned home late, Olivia was sitting on the balcony, her gaze fixed on the shimmering city skyline. He stepped up behind her, but she didn't turn around. It felt as though he'd lost her completely. Swallowing the pain in his voice, he called softly, "Olivia." She didn't turn her head, but this time she responded. "How does it feel, Ethan?" Ethan frowned. "Feel what?" Olivia turned to face him, her eyes calm but carrying a deep, buried pain. "To lose control." She stepped closer, and in that moment, Ethan felt smaller than he ever had. "I was once like you, caught in a storm I couldn't stop, watching everything around me collapse with nothing I could do. And now, you're living through it. She lightly touched his chest, right over his heart. That's exactly what you made me feel. Ethan stood frozen, consumed by his own fear. For the first time, he understood powerlessness. For the first time, Ethan Caldwell didn't know what to do. For the first time, he was no longer the one controlling this game. Olivia had won, but the most terrifying part was, Ethan wasn't sure if he could live with this defeat. The luxurious penthouse of Ethan Caldwell was no longer a symbol of power as it once had been. Now it was just an empty, cold space, much like his own life. Olivia Bennett was still there, but not truly present. She moved past him every day without leaving a trace. No anger, no resentment, no need for revenge anymore. Because Ethan had already destroyed himself, and that hurt more than any punishment ever could. Ethan decided to change, not for Olivia, but for himself. He realized that apologies alone weren't enough. He had to act, starting with the smallest things. Ethan dug up files on the companies he'd once ruined, the families who'd lost everything because of his cold decisions. For the first time in his life, he confronted the consequences of actions he'd never bothered to consider before. He sent apologies to each one, not expecting forgiveness, just so they'd know he'd recognized his mistakes. He reached out to charities, donating a large portion of his fortune to rebuild the small businesses he'd once crushed. He quietly helped Olivia's mother, a woman who'd lost everything after her husband's death, now living alone in a modest apartment on the outskirts of town. He did all of this without telling Olivia, because it wasn't about her anymore. It was about the man he'd become. Olivia noticed the change, but she wasn't ready to trust it yet. One evening, Ethan returned home, exhausted after a long day. He didn't expect anything, just accepted that this was the life he had to face now. But as he stepped into the living room, he saw Olivia standing there, waiting for him. For the first time in months, she sought him out. "What have you been doing?" she asked, her voice calm but her eyes full of questions. Ethan didn't pretend not to understand. He simply shrugged. "I'm making amends." She studied him for a long moment. "For me?" He shook his head. "No, for me." His answer caught Olivia off guard, because for the first time, Ethan Caldwell was no longer the man trying to control the world. He was learning to let go, and that shook her. One evening, Olivia asked him a question he hadn't anticipated. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft but weighted with meaning, "if I left, would you chase after me?" Ethan looked up at her. In the past, he would have done anything to keep her, would have found a way to control the situation, would have refused to let her walk away. But now, he understood. He shook his head. "No, Olivia," he said slowly, his eyes gentle but resolute. "I'd let you go, because you're not something to hold on to." She fell silent. For the first time, her gaze wasn't a barrier anymore. Perhaps this was what she'd been waiting for. Perhaps Ethan's true change wasn't in his acts of atonement, but in his ability to let go. Conclusion: a new beginning. Olivia didn't leave. She stayed not because she was bound, but because she chose to. Between them there was no longer a bet, no longer a game of power. Just two people learning to love again from the beginning. One day, Olivia discovered she was pregnant. She told Ethan on a late afternoon, as the gentle sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm golden glow across his face. He'd thought about how he might react if this ever happened, but when he heard those words from her, he simply smiled. "I'll do it right this time," he said, his voice trembling but filled with determination. Olivia looked at him for a long time, then nodded, and for the first time, she believed he truly could. On the high-rise balcony, Ethan and Olivia stood side by side, looking down at the city that had once been their battlefield. But now, it was no longer a place of power games. It was where they would start a new life together.